I will begin. I'll begin by sharing my slides. One moment here. Hope you can see that okay. So, as Tony mentioned, I will say a few things about the history of the organization, how I became involved in it, and our time frame
On
today,
what?
our focus today, will be the pioneer period of Los Angeles, which essentially, from a Jewish perspective, is the 1850s to the very early 20th century, with even some examples from a bit earlier than that. So, as was mentioned, even if you've been in Los Angeles for a while, you probably weren't around in the 1870s or 1880s. So, that part of the history should be exciting and new. And it's often very interesting to learn how long our people have been in places that we are now living. So that being said, the organization, the Western States Jewish History Association, really began with the journal of Dr. Norton Stern, who was an optometrist and a Hebrew school principal in Los Angeles. He started in 1968 the journal Western States Historical Quarterly, or Jewish Historical Quarterly, which became a little bit later, a couple decades later, the Western States Jewish History Journal. Some of you may have seen it. It's been around for 50 years plus, actually. The initial run of the journal as a quarterly was from 1968 to 2018. And during that period, the journal published some 2,000 articles, and about 500 of those focus on Los Angeles, both because Norton Stern and then his later partner, Rabbi William Kramer, were both Los Angelinos. And they spent a lot of time researching the deep history of Jewish involvement and contributions in Los Angeles. But the journal also has continuously been published through this association, which is Southern California um, located. The journal was actually relaunched in 2021, just very recently. For a number of years prior to that, for 2 decades, Gladys Sturman, who I think many of you know, and David Epstein were the co-publishers, co-editors of the journal. They decided to discontinue it in 2018 after a good, healthy 50-year run. And I was brought on really afterwards to essentially maintain the association as its president, and also to um, maintain the website, which we'll see in just a moment as well. If you haven't visited yet yourself, there is the Jewish Museum of the American West. I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. But out of the blue, I got an invitation from Texas Tech University Press to relaunch the journal as an academic peer-reviewed journal instead of a more folksy local history journal. It is now a prestigious um, academic journal. All of the pluses and minuses that come with that, I can tell you as the editor, it's quite a slog. But we've assembled a great editorial committee from universities and historical societies around the country, and we're now in kind of the second, or actually third phase of the journal as this professional historian's journal. How did I get involved with this? Well, as I mentioned, in 2019 or so, David Epstein invited me to continue this really a magnificent website that he established, the Jewish Museum of the American West. It is an online museum. We have about 600, actually now well more than 600 individual exhibits continuing to grow on that website, which you can visit at any time. It is located on the web, so you could be visiting it right now as I'm talking. I wouldn't mind. But nevertheless, you can see the website there, jmaw.org. And we have exhibition halls representing all of the states west of the Mississippi and a few other places, including Western Canada, parts of Mexico, Hawaii, the Pacific Rim region is well represented as well. So as the journal has continued to expand over the years, even what is considered
The
the
poker
Western
dice.
states
What is
has
it?
expanded along with it.
The roster.
I hear somebody. I'm sorry. We should be muted. Anyway, so that being said, I knew David Epstein for some years. I contributed some articles to the journal. I'm primarily a musicologist myself. My day job, as it were, I'm a professor of Jewish music history at the Academy for Jewish Religion in Los Angeles. It's a trans-denominational seminary that trains rabbis, cantors, chaplains, and other Jewish professionals. I'm also the associate dean of the master's program at that institution. And in addition, I had written a few books on Jewish musicians in the American West. And basically, David Epstein said, "You like to write, you're an academic, why don't you take it from here?" So he is expecting me to continue with this for at least another 20 years. We'll see how that goes. But in 2013, he established this website, Jewish Museum of the American West, which has really been quite marvelous for us. That's really how the Texas Tech University Press found us. And also another publisher, Arcadia Publishing. You may have seen these kinds of books floating around, very popular series, the Images of America series. I got an email from them a couple years ago to put together a book on the Jewish Gold Country, which is up in the northern part of the state, using photographs from our archives. We have several thousand photographs in our historical archives, and also materials from our museum. And then I followed up with Jewish Los Angeles, which is going to be our topic today. So if you're interested in this, just a quick plug. This is a museum product. All proceeds go to the museum. But you can find this book, Jewish Los Angeles, wherever books are sold, which these days is basically Amazon and everybody else. So one of the guiding principles, I would say, for this whole project of uncovering the lives of Jewish people and Jewish contributors in the American West is this quotation from Scottish historian and essayist Thomas Carlyle. "History is the essence of innumerable biographies." For the most part, the articles that I mentioned, the 2,000 plus articles, most of the exhibits, the 600 plus exhibits on our museum website, are biographies, biographical in nature. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is in the early days, in particular, again, the pioneer period, mid 1800s to early 20th century, you would find a Jew or a few Jews, or maybe enough to have a small congregation in different towns throughout the American West. And focusing on those biographies is really how we understand what kinds of involvements these people had, how they contributed to their communities, where they came from, what kind of patterns they might have been a part of, and trailblazing themselves. So the idea of focusing on biographies is really important when you're trying to piece together the stories or the kind of collective story of minorities in an area where there just aren't that many of them. And we'll see that playing out in Los Angeles as well in the very early days. But it's important also to note the innumerable biographies. These would be people who, without the interest of genealogists and historians and collectors and so forth, we probably wouldn't even know of. These are the less known, sort of unheralded people who, as it turns out, often were founders of towns or very instrumental in the establishment of cities and hospitals and organizations. All of this will play out. In Los Angeles, there are a lot of very important Jews who were instrumental in the city's institutions, names that you may or may not know, but you probably should. And that's part of what we'll be talking about today. But before we get there, just some uh, bullet points on how Jewish life in the American West during this pioneer period was a little bit different than elsewhere in the country, certainly elsewhere in the world. So we're talking here again, 1850s to probably the 1890s, early 20th century. For the most part, Jews who came west tended to be less observant than Jews who stayed in Europe or on the East Coast. And the reason for this is probably pretty self-explanatory. If you are, as I mentioned, living in a place where there aren't that many Jews, that means no access to kosher food until there's enough Jews to support such a thing. Not a synagogue until there are enough Jews in the area. Certainly a mikveh, things that would be required for an Orthodox Jewish life as we understand it, just wouldn't be there for those people who are coming to these new towns or founding towns where they might have been the only Jewish family or one of just a few. So it took a certain kind of adventurous spirit coupled with the ability to kind of let go of some of the old trappings of Jewish life. Very interestingly, those Jews who didn't sort of surrender to the dominant culture in different places in the American West and didn't start eating pork and other things, which was very common actually, those who refused to do that became known as egg eaters because they would eat eggs for protein. That was sort of a neutral food, not subject to any of the kosher laws. So if you saw people sitting around eating a lot of eggs, it was thought that those must be Jews. Another thing is tolerance. There is a virtual absence of anti-Semitism in the West compared to elsewhere in the United States, especially in the Northwest. And what this means is that Jews coming to this kind of frontier, they were, for the most part, white-skinned, like other European immigrants who were coming to the region. They often were just called Germans because Yiddish sounded so much like German, or because they spoke German themselves, having come perhaps from Germany or German-speaking lands. Really what characterized this transition or this expansion into the American West was this idea of the Western self-made man or woman, as it were. We know that this idea is somewhat faulty from a historical perspective. There were a lot more factors that went into it than just being able to pass as white, but that was a big part of it. So if you could do that, if you were a European Jew and you came with your merchant skills from the old country, if you were able to peddle and then establish a dry goods store and that kind of thing, which is very common, especially up in the gold country and also in Los Angeles, then that's all that mattered. If you could do what you needed to do in the West to succeed, nobody really cared, according to the historical record, if you were Jewish or anything else, which is quite rare in Jewish history. And for that reason, my predecessor, David Epstein, used to refer to this entire project of the Jewish expansion into the American West as a Jewish golden age. I think he coined something that hasn't necessarily caught on, but I think there's some truth to that, in the sense that it really was a wide open area. Just some examples of that. Jews were welcomed into elite circles in San Francisco at a time when Jews in New York were being excluded from such societies. And in Los Angeles, Jews would occupy most political positions in the city, that is on the sort of police level, on the council level, etc. Jews found their way into positions. So again, if you had the ability to succeed, you basically could. Another very interesting aspect is the interreligious activities. Jews engaged in interreligious cooperation much earlier and with more ease in the West than they did in the rest of the country. So we have examples from places that you might not expect, like um, Salt Lake City and Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Oklahoma City. Some places that you might expect. San Francisco, certainly, as I mentioned, Los Angeles, Boise, Idaho had early interreligious cooperation between Jews and Christians. Uh, Portland, Denver, Fargo, North Dakota. It's kind of a repeating pattern. And part of that, too, was all of these communities were fairly new, and they relied on each other for some support and uh, stability in these early days. So it wasn't uncommon for Jews to be involved in building projects for the Catholics and for Catholics to help the Jews establish their synagogue buildings, etc. We'll see this playing out in Los Angeles as well. Another aspect is civic involvement. That is, that Jews were often the first in a town to create organizations, usually benevolent societies, and helped found charity organizations, hospitals, and fraternal lodges. That is very true of Los Angeles. The first charitable organization in Los Angeles was the Hebrew Benevolent Society, established in 1854. And the first women's charity, the Ladies Hebrew Benevolent Society, founded in 1870, was the first women's charity organization. And also Jews were involved in Los Angeles as founders of the Masons and the Odd Fellows and B'nai B'rith, and of course, and all the other kind of fraternal organizations. And again, that's a pattern that we see elsewhere. And then finally, another word of introduction is decentralization. Western Jews were not beholden to establishment norms as they were back east. Again, as a product of the land being very spread out and in many places sparsely populated, Jews were able to kind of experiment and figure out how they wanted their communities to be created and perceived and evolve over time. As an example, in 1877, 84% of Western Jews resided in California, primarily due to the gold rush and its aftermath, the settlement that followed. But the population was not really concentrated in a single spot. According to the US Census, Jews resided in more communities in California than anywhere else in the Union, including in New York. So what that means is that they had a lot of community representation, that there would be a few families here, a few families there, a synagogue here, a benevolent society over there, but it was decentralized. And what this meant in a practical sense was freedom to, again, kind of reinvent your Jewish identity and your identity as an American. And we'll see that playing out in Los Angeles as well. So another very helpful quote, this one is from the late, great Rabbi Leonard Bierman. This was a place not known for following everybody else, a place where somebody like me could come along, stir things up, and not get kicked out. And if you know anything about Rabbi Bierman and his history in Los Angeles as the rabbi of Leo Back Temple, he didn't get kicked out, and he certainly stirred things up from time to time. That being said, this statement was from the 1950s, but really it reflected 100 years of Jewish history in the area, where again, because it was decentralized and because it was kind of a new frontier, Jews could, in general, whether they were rabbis or lay people, secular or religious, they could stir things up and not get kicked out. This is very reminiscent also of a quote from Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, who was also, by the way, very influential in the establishment of the University of Judaism, now the American Jewish University, back in the 1940s. But he presented a talk at Wilshire Boulevard Temple in the 1950s, and he was asked, what is the difference between Jews in the East and Jews who come West? And his answer, I think, resonates again to this day. And that is that Jews came West to start a new life, not to repeat the patterns of the past. And again, this will play out over and over in the history of Jewish Los Angeles. So with all of that being said, our first example, this is looks like a very modest representation or um, cut and pasted image from a census, and that's essentially what it is. But there's a very important name here at the top. Jacob Frankfurt, misspelled. Jacob Frankfurt was the name. And this is census from 1850. He was the first known Jew, Jacob Frankfurt, in what was known as the Mexican Pueblo de Los Angeles in 1841. He came to the area as part of the Roland Workman Exploratory Party, traveling west from Santa Fe, New Mexico. He was German born. Of course, Germany wasn't a country until 1871, but he came from that region. And he is actually the first Jewish name in the city that we're aware of. He operated a tailor business and a men's clothing store in the corner shop of Bell's Row, a two-story adobe building at the southeast corner of Aliso and Los Angeles streets. And that was the tallest building in the city at the time, if you can believe it. This was considered a skyrise, sort of skyscraper. But that being said, this building was built in 1845 by Alexander Bell, and then later named for the new owner, Mellis. But you can see Henry Mellis by the if you're writing any of this down. But when it became known as Mellis Row, you can see that Solomon Lazard, another Jewish name, had a shop in this building. And in fact, there were 8 Jewish names listed in the 1850 census that I showed you a bit of earlier. And those 8 people were men, perhaps married, perhaps not, perhaps coming to LA to kind of figure out if it's a viable place. And they all lived and worked in Bell's Row at that time. Most of them actually would leave Los Angeles for places like San Francisco, which were a little more bustling in those days. But still, this is kind of where it all began. This is another very important early contributor to Los Angeles, Solomon Nunez Carvajal. He himself is very much a storied character. You can read a lot more about him than I'll be able to present here. He wrote very extensive diary of his journeys and his life. So he's by no means a forgotten figure. But he was an artist and a photographer of Spanish-Portuguese Jewish descent, born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1815. He joined John Charles Fremont's 5th expedition to the West, arriving in Los Angeles in 1854. Solomon took up residence for a few months in a studio on the 2nd floor of La Tienda de China, a fancy dry goods store on Main Street owned by 2 Sephardic brothers, Samuel and Joseph Labat. These brothers, along with Carvajal, were instrumental in founding the Hebrew Benevolent Society, which I mentioned started in 1854. And by the way, the Benevolent Society still exists. It's now Jewish Family Service. So this is a very old organization. And as I mentioned, it's the first chartered nonprofit organization in the city. So as I mentioned, Carvajal was only in LA for a few months. During that time, he painted a portrait. He was a portrait painter of Pio Pico, the last governor of Alta California under Mexican rule, and other prominent residents of the area at that time. Unfortunately, all of these paintings have been lost. Not that they don't exist somewhere, we just haven't found them. They probably don't exist, but I'm still holding out hope. And in 1854, a little bit later in the year, Carvalho went back east. He landed in Baltimore and never returned west. But he is also famous for doing something else, and that is painting this particular portrait. This isn't a great um, representation of it. Again, you can look this portrait up online. It's an oil painting and very much colorful painting. This is just the image that I had handy. But this is Abraham Lincoln and Diogenes from around 1865. Don't know if it was painted before or after the assassination of Lincoln, but what's important about this painting is that it was the only painting done of Lincoln by a Jew who was living at the time of Lincoln, if that makes sense. So a contemporary of Lincoln who happens to be Jewish painted a portrait of Lincoln. This one now, by the way, is housed at Brandeis University. But it's an interesting painting because if you know anything about the Greek myth of Diogenes, he scoured the world with a lantern looking for the one single enlightened person that he would encounter. So he would go around with this lantern. And you can see in this image that he's dropping the lantern. Why? Because he's so surprised that he actually found the one enlightened man, Abraham Lincoln. And by the way, this behind Lincoln is sort of a classical statue of George Washington. So it's quite an interesting portrait. That brings us to Joseph Newmark, another very important early Los Angelino of Jewish descent. He was a Portuguese-born shochet, or a ritual slaughterer, who arrived in New York City in 1824, where he was the founder of the city's first Ashkenazic synagogue, B'nai Yeshurun. Joseph and his wife Rosa arrived in San Francisco in 1852, and 2 years later moved south to Los Angeles. Joseph entered the wholesale retail dry goods business of Newmark, Kramer and Co., and was also a founder of the Hebrew Benevolent Society in 1854. He was really the lay rabbi of Los Angeles until 1862, when he brought in Rabbi Abraham Wolf Edelman from San Francisco to lead the newly constituted Congregation B'nai B'rith, which would evolve into Wilshire Boulevard Temple. So more on that later, but that is Joseph Newmark. Now this is a very interesting landmark. This is really all that's left of the first Jewish site in Los Angeles, the Jewish cemetery, established in 1855, where? At Chavez Ravine, where we now have Dodger Stadium. You can visit this plaque next time you go to see the Dodgers. That being said, the Hebrew Benevolent Society of Los Angeles established a Jewish cemetery in 1855 at Lilac Terrace and Lookout Drive in Chavez Ravine. The cemetery fulfilled the society's goal of, quote, procuring a piece of ground suitable for the purpose of a burying ground for the deceased of their own faith, and also to appropriate a portion of their time and means to the holy cause of benevolence. So I think this is right near the Police Academy in Elysian Park. Again, if you ever want to visit what remains of the first Jewish cemetery and first Jewish site in Los Angeles. Now here's a rather amusing picture. You see these very happy children. In those days, of course, photography was a slow process. So you can imagine they all have like wooden boards on their backs to make them stand still and stand straight, and they're not having a very good time. These children are actually the children of the non-Jewish superintendent of that first Jewish cemetery. Oscar Willenberg was his name. And on Saturdays, when there weren't any funerals, he would have his children, again, looking very happy to do so, sweep the cemetery grounds and make sure that everything looked tidy and neat. The property, the cemetery property at Chavez Ravine was sold in October of 1902, and between 1902 and 1910, the remains were moved to the Home of Peace Cemetery in East Los Angeles, which is still there, originally run by Congregation B'nai B'rith. And of course, in 1859, they broke ground on Dodger Stadium. There's a whole sordid history of that, kicking out the residents of Mexican descent, etc. You may be familiar with those stories. And the stadium was completed in 1962. And this is the first building of Congregation B'nai B'rith, seen here in 1873. Congregation B'nai B'rith, today Wilshire Boulevard Temple. The congregation found its way to Wilshire Boulevard in 1929, and shortly thereafter called itself Wilshire Boulevard Temple. But this is the oldest congregation in Los Angeles. The congregation predates the building. This is very common. So in 1862, the B'nai B'rith, Congregation B'nai B'rith became a chartered institution with the state of California and kind of floated around from various locations. As the Jewish community was growing, it became obvious that they needed to have a building of their own, and that's where we have this building in 1873. By the way, in 1870, the city census of Los Angeles counted just 5,728 residents, if you can believe it. And of those, 330 were Jews. So it doesn't sound like a very big number. But according to Norton Stern, who I mentioned was the, he founded our organization, Western States Jewish History Association, and also our journal, Western States Jewish History. He calculated that that meant that 5.76% of residents in Los Angeles were Jewish in 1870, which was actually a larger percentage than New York in that year. Of course, that predated by about a decade the beginning of the massive wave of Eastern European Jews who would arrive in New York. But nevertheless, there was a time when there were more Jews in Los Angeles by percentage, not by number, but by percentage, than in New York. And by the way, little trivia, we know that Wilshire Boulevard Temple is one of the flagship Reform synagogues and really has been proudly Reform for as long as any of us can remember. But it began as an Orthodox synagogue. Why? Because in those early days, as I mentioned, most Jews who came west weren't necessarily inclined to join a synagogue, to involve themselves in Jewish ritual outside of the high holidays and other major events. It was the Orthodox Jews who were clamoring to have a synagogue. And over time, through a process of organic and gradual shifts and different leadership, etc., the community would officially become Reform. But it took quite a few decades to get to that point. I mentioned earlier Rabbi Abraham Edelman. He's the first official rabbi of Los Angeles. He was born in Poland in 1832 and immigrated to America in 1851 with his wife, Hannah. And for 8 years, Hannah and Abraham were living in San Francisco. And that's where Joseph Newmark, who I mentioned earlier, who was serving as a lay rabbi of Los Angeles, became aware of Abraham Edelman and saw this rather proper and debonair rabbi as somebody who could really take the Jewish community in Los Angeles to the next level. He was seen more of as someone who could be a rabbi in an emerging and potentially big city someday, which Los Angeles was becoming. So Edelman would serve as the rabbi of Congregation B'nai B'rith from 1862 to 1885. And this is a little artifact that I find very interesting too. This is the bar mitzvah of his son, David W. Edelman. This is the invitation to that bar mitzvah, February 1882, Congregation B'nai B'rith. David has the distinction of having studied medicine. He went on to study medicine at Columbia University and became the first Los Angeles-born Jewish doctor. And I know how important doctors are to Jewish families and Jewish culture, so that's pretty significant. In fact, in 1929, when the congregation would move to Wilshire Boulevard, David would serve as its president. And in later years, he became the chief of staff at Cedars of Lebanon Hospital, which of course is now Cedars-Sinai. So a very important doctor if you're interested in medical history. All right. Now, this is something I alluded to a little bit earlier. This is on the left, we see St. Vincent's College, established in 1865. And on the right, Rosa Newmark, the wife of Joseph Newmark. She was quite instrumental in the establishment of this college, which was the first institute of higher learning in Los Angeles, founded again in 1865. And St. Vincent's College probably wasn't a Jewish college, you're thinking. That's right, it was Catholic. So Jewish pioneers, as I alluded to earlier, in the West were often involved in interreligious cooperation and support systems. And that was certainly true of Rosa Newmark. She led the way with fundraising and boosterism to get this St. Vincent's College to be established. And this wasn't really that unusual. Between 1856 and 1876 in Los Angeles, Jews were, and this is, Jews of prominence, prominent Jewish community members in LA were supportive, both financially and otherwise, in the establishment of the first orphanage in Los Angeles, which was Catholic, improvements to the Catholic cemetery, renovations to the first Catholic church, the construction of the first cathedral in Los Angeles. And again, it was a time of mutual support. Money was very much scarce at certain points. So the moneyed families would sort of support each other across religious lines, as it were. And it went both ways. Catholics were very supportive of Jewish organizations as well. So in this slide, we see Harrison Frank's store, the London Clothing Company. Leopold Harris and Charles Jacobi were, this is prior to this, were Prussian-born proprietors of Harrison Jacobi, a general merchandise store that was found in, or was established in 1871. In 1873, that earlier store was one of the first on record advertising the Christmas and New Year's novelties, noting that Santa Claus will hold sway during the season and goods will be offered at excessively low rates. So I know that this is Christmas season, and you've probably heard a lot about Jewish involvement in Christmas music, Christmas movies, all of that kind of stuff. It's something you might take some pride in, even as you might cringe when you hear Christmas music everywhere. Just know that 9 times out of 10, a Jew wrote that song. So, in a way, it's a de facto Jewish holiday, we might say. Nevertheless, Jews were also at the forefront of the commercialization of Christmas at various stores. So that was true in New York with the department stores and the shops in New York, and certainly in Los Angeles as well. So I mentioned this earlier store. Then what we have pictured here Herman Frank would join Leopold Harris. Frank arrived in Los Angeles from Walla Walla, Washington in 1887 and began working for Harris in his clothing retail business. When Herman became a partner in the company the following year, the name was changed to the London Clothing Company, and then to Harris and Frank. The first Harris and Frank store was located at the southwest corner of Spring and Temple Streets. And again, it was among the first Los Angeles stores to feature what was then called the Christmas effect, with holiday decorations and window displays to lure in customers. Look, you got a store, it's Christmas season, you want to make money, you decorate it, you deck the halls, as it were, to lure people in. And there's no shame in that. That's something that we see in Jewish stores throughout the country at that time and to this day. This is an image, Congregation Beth Israel, the Olive Street Shul, founded in 1902. No longer an active building, but very interesting. It began as a merger of three other small traditionalist congregations in the downtown area. And this represented kind of a new phenomenon in LA. Beginning in the 1890s or so, Eastern European Orthodox Jews were trickling into the city, much more so than they were before, from the Midwest and from the East Coast. The population in LA prior to that were mostly German-speaking or considered themselves quote-unquote German Jews, which meant a lot of different things, but basically they considered themselves more Americanized, more of the elite, etc. And it wasn't until the 1890s, early 20th century, that a sizable number of Eastern European Jews started to find their way to Los Angeles. And this particular congregation, technically called the Beth Israel, but also known as the Olive Street Shul, was one of the early truly Orthodox communities, Eastern European style Orthodox communities in Los Angeles. Here we have a photo of Sarah Vasson. And Sarah Vasson was born in Quincy, Illinois in 1870. She was one of 9 children, and it is said that throughout her early childhood, she became very interested in pregnancy and child rearing because she saw so much of it going on around her in her own home. And at an early age, she became interested in gynecology and obstetrics, which in those days was incredibly rare for a woman, as you might imagine. In 1890, Vasson entered medical school at Keokuk College of Medicine in Iowa and became its first female graduate. In 1904, she came to Los Angeles, where she became a physician and supervisor at Casper Cone Hospital, which was actually a forerunner of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. She was the hospital's first superintendent, and from everything we can detect, the first Jewish woman to practice medicine in Los Angeles. I should mention something about Casper Cone too. That's one of those names that you should be familiar with if you live in Los Angeles, but I think it's been kind of hidden in more recent years. But Casper Cone was a very charitable-minded philanthropist who made a lot of money in hides and wools and invested a lot in real estate and banking and utilities ventures as well. And he was instrumental in what became the Home of Peace Cemetery, which I mentioned earlier, the Vista Del Mar Child and Family Services, which is still around, the City of Hope National Medical Center, Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, Union Bank. All of these institutions came from him and his partners, which is really quite fascinating as well. So when we talk about Jews who have a legacy and an impact on a city, throughout the ages, I think Casper Cone is really way up there on the list. And I just want to conclude with one more slide before we get to our Q&A. This is the B'nai B'rith Messenger. It's a now defunct Jewish newspaper, but had quite a long and storied history in Los Angeles. In 1897, Lionel Edwards founded this newspaper as a bi-weekly Jewish newspaper, an Anglo newspaper, Anglo-Jewish meaning in English. I believe there were Yiddish papers in the LA area starting around 1915. So this predates that phenomenon, again, predating even the arrival of a lot of the Eastern European Jews who would support a Yiddish newspaper. Nevertheless, this newspaper was originally called the Emmanuel, which was a bit of a kind of bold choice. A lot of chutzpah went into that. Emmanuel, of course, is the flagship synagogue of San Francisco. And it was thought that this newspaper would be viable in San Francisco as well. So why not call it Emmanuel, so it would appeal to to that community as well. Of course, the rabbi up there, Jacob Vorsanger, had an issue with that. And as a result, the name was changed rather quickly, about a year later, to B'nai B'rith, which again was the major congregation in Los Angeles, Congregation B'nai B'rith. So this newspaper, again, 1897 to 1995, it would grow and change as the population would grow and change, the Jewish population in Los Angeles during that almost 100-year period. And when the paper started in 1897, there were about 100,000 residents in Los Angeles, approximately 3,000 Jews. And when it ended in 1995, the Los Angeles area was home to something like 3 million people and around 500,000 Jews. So you can just tell all of the different changes and expansions and growth that this newspaper witnessed. In fact, one of the things that we've done with the Western States Jewish History Association was to collect the B'nai B'rith Messenger throughout those years and pull out a number of stories which have been reprinted in our journal as well. It's really quite a wonderful way to learn about a city through its newspapers. So that brings us to today. And depending on how you count the population, whether you're looking just at LA City or the county, and how you consider other cities and counties around the world, LA is either the second or the fourth or the third, I guess, to largest Jewish population in the world. After New York City, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem. Again, some people say it goes New York, LA, then Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Depends on how you count. The point is, it's in the top four, which of course is a great success story when we're talking about the early days, the census from 1850, which showed just 8 Jewish names in Los Angeles. So certainly the Jewish community has grown in LA, and I don't have to tell you that LA itself has grown quite a bit over the years as well. So that's my slides, and I'd love to chat if you have anything to add or ask.
Okay, people, if you want to ask a question, yes, absolutely, unmute yourself, and I can try and meter the questions so we don't inundate Jonathan all at once. I actually have my own question.
Sure.
The location of the first Jewish cemetery, you said, was at Lilac Terrace and Lookout.
Right. Yeah. Let me get the exact specifics on that.
Because I drive that way quite often, and I pass by the police academy entrance. I want to know if.
Yeah, it's right over there. So let me see. I actually I'm not great with roads and all that stuff. That's one of my problems. um, but I'll get that for you right here. One
Okay,
second.
no rush. Other questions while he's researching that one?
Yeah. Yeah. So that was Lookout Drive.
Lookout Drive. Okay,
That's what
Gary,
I thought, but
So
I get
why
all
did
that
the
stuff.
B'nai B'rith messenger come to a close in 1995?
Sorry, say that again.
Why did the messenger close down in 1995?
That's an excellent question. I'm sure a number of factors. I actually don't know off the top of my head, but I know the Jewish Journal would grow out of it, and it sort of continued. LA has never been without a Jewish newspaper, but it's often the case that internal mismanagement and that kind of thing could have been a contributor. I'm not sure, but I'll look into that because that's a great question. Yeah,
Dennis?
Dennis.
Thank you. This is a fascinating talk. I was curious about some of your source material. I mean, you've shown us newspapers. Were there letters, diaries, and other things that you've been able to draw on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I must say that today's presentation and the book that I showed you, Jewish Los Angeles, it's 90% indebted to Norton Stern, who, as I mentioned, was a optometrist by profession, but is also considered the founder of LA Jewish history in the sense of a field. When he came to LA, he noticed that there was almost nothing available. So he did exactly what you're saying, going around to people's houses. He would find a name of somebody mentioned in a newspaper and try to find if they have any descendants who are still living. And so he would collect personal papers and diaries and business ledgers and all that kind of stuff. So like I said, we have about 4,000 photographs and other images. Most of that comes from that really intensive work, and most of it is also California based. So certainly newspapers, but then like the process would be, you find a newspaper, you find a Jewish name, right? We know what those are. And then he would do kind of the follow-up work, going to a cemetery and then going to the records and this sort of thing. It's sometimes called tombstone history as a result, this kind of process, because you really are starting from a name and then trying to fill in the gaps. So it's really remarkable. I think I'm a little bit spoiled at where I sit now. All of that work has been done for me. There's very few pockets to really examine as far as that goes. But yeah, you're intuiting the process, certainly.
I had one other question.
Yeah.
You told us how far west is the Journal of Jewish History is extending. What do you still consider east? I mean west. How far east can we go?
Yeah, it's really kind of a state of mind, right? What is the West? So I can tell you that in my time as the editor of the journal, which is only one issue printed, another one in process, and a third just completed gathering materials. So really just 3 issues. Minnesota has become quite a popular place, with its view towards the West, more so than to the East, and its connection to the West. So you might not often think of the Midwest, right, as the West, but that is increasingly, and throughout the journal's history, in the purview. We even had a couple of book reviews, one on Chicago, which is not even within our historically geographical purview. Also Jews of Cleveland, right? So I think you're also intuiting that we're expanding. I mean, in a way, though, what this kind of tells us is American Jewish history historically has been very New York focused, right? So most of what we think of as the history of
Yeah.
Jews in the US kind of begins and ends with Ellis Island and whatever happens afterwards, right? So talking about musical theater and all of that as well. So when the journal was beginning in 1968, there was very little published about Jewish history, Jewish involvements really outside of New York, let alone, as far west as California. So part of it is just, we could say this is the journal of Jewish history outside of New York in some ways. But we try to be true to our regional focus. But places like, Louisiana, which is more of kind of a bridge between the East and the, we do spill into other regions quite a bit, which, just means that it's a little bit easier to collect articles for the journal. The wider our scope, the more is acceptable, in terms of what we publish. But it's a very good question. I've been kind of grappling with that too.
One of the reasons I asked is that I grew up in Detroit, in Michigan,
Yeah.
and I would be speaking to someone from Nebraska or Kansas, and I'm saying that I grew up in the Midwest. And they'd say, "What? That's not
Yeah.
the Midwest."
Yeah, exactly. It's very territorial. And, if you have anything to contribute to the journal from your own past, we're all for it. I should mention that too. Even our museum, you can look at through the museum. If you have, a family history that you want to share, I can help you to create an exhibit as well. If you have, a rich story with artifacts, etc. So it's always growing. And as I mentioned, it's a story of multiple biographies. So the more sort of mass of biographies that we can collect, the better understanding we have of the different Jewish populations, the different migration patterns, the different occupations and avocations of Jews. All of that is very helpful. So that is an open invitation.
So my hometown of St. Louis is known as the gateway to the West because of it being the origins of the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, I think historically too, because of HUC in Cincinnati, that was another area that had a lot of interest among historians. So, adding to that story, it's New York, Cincinnati, of course, Chicago, and maybe Florida, later. But, again, we're kind of everything else.
Okay. Tony, you were next.
Yeah. I can remember the B'nai B'rith Messenger, and then the lag between the circulation publication of the Jewish Journal. But for anybody that's interested, we were longtime subscribers to the Jewish Journal, and those of you who've been in our house know it's overloaded with books and materials. So we donated several of the magazines to the synagogue library at Adat. And we're resubscribing now that it's republished, because I always find such interesting things to read in it. And we do have your book. And Terry Ellis, I hope you take up Jonathan Friedman's suggestion and write something up about your father's wonderful exhibit that you still have, because it's very much a part. Her dad was a Holocaust survivor, and he did this most magnificent exhibit, and Terry still has it. He's unfortunately passed away, but maybe some of us could help her put it together to include in the history of Jewish Los Angeles.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Yeah. I will say that I appreciate you mentioning that. It is again an open invitation for sure. Part of the limitations that I had in putting that book together was I was restricted to photographs that were in our archives, because it's really a museum book, and also photographs had to be of a certain quality in order to be suitable for publication. So there were so many stories that I didn't get to tell, and it's only kind of scratching the surface. And of course, these days too, LA Jewish history is expanding a little bit beyond what my journal and my predecessors had focused on primarily, which were the sorts of people I mentioned today, who are, you know, the big name kind of contributors to institutions, etc. The Boyle Heights area, which recently has gained a lot of attention, which was really the center of LA Jewry from the 20s to the 50s. There is a wonderful exhibit now through UCLA on Jewish Los Angeles, focusing on that. As I mentioned, Yiddish newspapers and sort of the Yiddish unions and so forth in that neighborhood. Those are gaining a lot of attention too. So I don't want to pretend like history ends where my presentation today ends, because kind of the next phase of LA Jewish history was this robust migration of Eastern European Jews who, for the most part, were restricted to the Boyle Heights area because they didn't have housing covenants and they weren't rich enough to kind of buy their way into a posh neighborhood. And it, you know, it's kind of the period in between that migration and the opening up of the San Fernando Valley to Jewish residents that Boyle Heights was really the center of Jewish life to a great extent in Los Angeles, with something like I want to say 10,000 Jewish households at its peak in the Boyle Heights neighborhood, which is a lot in that concentrated, multicultural, multi-ethnic, working class neighborhood. So just want to give a plug for that as well.
Tony again, and then
Yeah.
Darlene.
Quick, that UCLA exhibit that you were referring to, is it something that's open to the public that we could get tickets for and go through?
Yeah, in fact, they do have a physical, or they did. I'm not sure what the state is now. The Boyle Heights Jewish history, I'm gonna get the name wrong, but there's a Jewish history tour that is done in Boyle Heights by Shmuel Gonzalez, who's also known as the Barrio Boychik. But he puts together talks there, and there's a building, a small building, and there was a physical site for this UCLA exhibit there. Boyle Heights Studio and History Tours or something like that. I'm not great with
Okay,
names.
but we can Google it and see what
Yeah,
we can find.
But I will say that the UCLA exhibit is online. So there's a lot of material that you can just dig through on, you know, from the comfort of your home as well. And that's pretty easy to find. Just kind of look up Mapping Jewish LA is what that is called. Mapping Jewish LA.
Darlene?
I have a couple of questions, probably more than that, but
Sure.
the two that kind of seem more burning to me is I was wondering if you would elaborate on two of the points that you made. You referenced that there were people who came to Jews who came to Los Angeles, prospered here, but moved on to larger circles in San Francisco. And I had noted that in reading the biography of Elias Hellman that his great-granddaughter wrote, Towers of Gold. And I wondered if that was sort of like moving from Boyle Heights to Beverly Hills.
It's very interesting. I haven't thought of it like that, but certainly, yeah, the Hellman story would certainly fit that description in the sense that the Hellman brothers, who would go on to establish the Wells Fargo Bank and other things, they started out in LA and really boomed in San Francisco, although they also had quite a lot of property in the LA area, as I'm sure you know, and made a big name for themselves here. Basically, the context for that is San Francisco was the first major city in California because of the gold rush. Really, overnight, it was transformed from a small town with tents and ranches and so forth into a metropolitan area. And that was just the influx of migrants and prospectors, et cetera, everyone trying to get in their hands on gold in one way or another. And the Jewish involvement there was primarily through banking and dry goods, et cetera. But if you can imagine, 1848, gold is discovered. By September 9th, 1850, California becomes a state. And it's really because of that influx of people to that region. So that had already been kind of the place to make money. And LA was, in the early days, kind of a supplier of cattle products and other things. It was mainly ranch land, just supplying the gold rush. So, like you mentioned, a lot of Jews who thought they could make some success in LA and maybe failed a little bit, or once they got enough money, they would go up to Northern California. And that was true for Jews who would be up in the gold country proper, who were supplying miners. When a mine would dry up, they would go to the next town and the next town, and then usually end up in the San Francisco area as well with a dry goods store or some kind of establishment like that. So, it's economic migration, I think, is a way of looking at it. Not only the reason why Jews came to the West in the first place, but where they would ultimately go when they come West. I don't know if that answers your question, but basically following where opportunity is and being really mobile in that way was a very big part of the story.
That makes a great deal of sense to me. My other question is, your slide alluded to anti-Semitism and the contrast between the acceptance of Jewish leadership and welcoming of Jews socially among the movers and shakers in Los Angeles in the early years, and then the growing othering of Jews that seemed to be coincidental with the greater number of Protestants and Yankees coming to the area, is something that I would appreciate your elaborating on.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so the early period, again, talking, 1850 to about the 1890s, was characterized by the kind of interreligious cooperation and Jews being founding members of these fraternal organizations and very much integrated and in leadership roles in different kind of prestige organizations in the city. As you allude to, in the 1890s in particular, and then into the early 20th century, that's when Midwest migrants start to come to LA, and largely bringing some of their own prejudices from that area. So the not only had organizations like synagogues and churches been able to kind of find their own footing by that point and sort of differentiate, they no longer depended on each other for money and other resources, but that coincided with this wave of migration from the Midwest, which not only brought Orthodox Jews to LA in considerable numbers, but also brought a lot of Midwest Protestants who didn't really understand this kind of collaboration and cooperation that had been indigenous to Los Angeles. And in fact, you find in testimonials of like pioneer Jews and even pioneer Catholics who were lamenting the fact that what they knew in LA of this kind of atmosphere was no longer the case, and how shameful it was that you couldn't anymore kind of visit a church on Sunday and a synagogue on Saturday and be welcomed equally in both places as a leader in the city. So absolutely, it coincided with that migration. Then, of course, in the 20s and 30s, with the Immigration Act of 24 and the xenophobia around that, the Depression, and of course the rise of Hitler and all of the Nazi sympathizers in the LA area as well, and anti-Hollywood, all of that stuff would just kind of seep into the culture. So it does stand out as remarkable how much anti-Semitism wasn't a problem in those early days, and how it almost didn't exist in any substantial way. I don't mean that people didn't talk behind a Jew's back or something like that, but institutionally, systemically, it just wasn't a factor, it seems, in Los Angeles in those early days. So yes, I elaborated on what you already said very eloquently, but we're in agreement for sure.
Other questions? Otherwise, I'll ask Tony to unmute and do the final thank yous. And we really appreciate, Jonathan, your coming to us today and making this presentation. We'd be delighted to have you back other times if you're willing.
I'd love to.
Okay.
We'd love to hear about the 20th century LA and Jews.
Absolutely. Part 2.
And part 3, maybe.
Yeah.
Tony?
Yes, thank you very much for your time. And both of the synagogues on this screen have a long history, and we hope to be able to celebrate our centennials, both Temple Beth Hillel and Adat Ariel. I have a whole collection of memorabilia that was left to me by one of our founding members, Rose Engel, who started our nursery school. And I just have to find a place to get it out of my house in a safe place in the synagogue, so that when centennial time comes, we'll have those collections. But thank you. It was very informative and a good follow-up to the exhibit that was at the Autry some years ago.
Yeah. And we were involved in that as well as an organization.
TJ Village. Oh, man. Okay,
And
you very
thank
much.
you, our
Thank you very
guest
much.
from Temple Judea, Darlene Daniel. Very good questions.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right.
And happy Hanukkah and Shabbat Shalom, everyone.